Actually, you might not have figured this out. You might have. But the shape of the day was all about getting to this panel. Not that the others weren't important, but they were all pieces of information that you needed to have so that these panelists could discuss the way forward in the public-private partnership. Is there such a thing viable? What will it look like? If it's viable, what are the legal, constitutional, practical, financial concerns? And I'm just going to introduce the moderator, who I want to tell you, when I first came to Fordham, I went to Washington, and I tried to figure out who from Fordham was involved with some kind of national security job. And I got together a whole bunch of bright young faces, and one of them was Joshua Larocca. And I just decided that he had to be part of the center. And then, without any reason that I understood, he moved to New York, which was really nice. And he is the managing director at Strauss Friedberg, and I am just delighted to have him on board. Prior to this, he was at the Department of Justice as a litigation counsel, so he should be able to handle this. Okay.
Thanks, Karen, and it's great to be here. I think we're starting this panel with 2 strikes against us. We are batting cleanup. And as Karen said earlier in the day, the panel format apparently is disfavored these days. So we're starting with 2 strikes against us, but with these panelists, I know we're going to avoid a 3rd strike and give you some final good, informative discussion to wrap up the day. Let me give brief introductions to the panelists. Suzanne Spaulding, Undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security. Leo Taddeo, Special Agent in charge of the Special Operations Cyber Division at the FBI. Michael Madon, Vice President of Business Development at Red Owl Analytics and previously Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at the Treasury Department. And Julia Angwin, Senior Reporter at the independent news organization ProPublica and the author of Dragnet Nation, A Quest for Privacy, Security, and Freedom in a World of Relentless Security. So
Surveillance.
Surveillance. There we go. We've heard a lot today, and we're going to touch upon topics that have certainly been discussed on earlier panels and earlier discussions, so hopefully we can weave them into our conversation. And I want to start with, and it's very timely given the votes in Congress last week, I want to start with the legislation, the 2 bills that you've heard referenced today, and I'm sure most people are aware of, H.R. 1731, H.R. 1560, 2 measures, complementary measures that are really meant to increase public-private sharing of data in this arena. The White House has put out 2 statements of administration policy that the Hill newspaper has described as cautious thumbs up to both measures. And I wanted, while noting some concerns with the measures as attention turns to the Senate, and I wanted to start off our discussion by turning to Suzanne to offer her perspective on the legislation.
All right, thank you, Joshua. And let me thank Fordham and the organizers of this conference for including me. It's really great to be here. I was really hoping to be here for Judge Wald's presentation, and Delta Airlines let me down. But I understand that I can thank her for saving us a lot of time on this panel, because she described the various bills that are in Congress, with her usual clarity and specificity, and so that's terrific. But it was really a treat to be here for the last panel and to see some old friends, Susan and Jim and others on the panel. It was terrific conversation, and I'm pleased to be here to have this conversation today. The legislation is actually making progress, as you heard, and I'm actually fairly optimistic that we'll see something enacted. And it is continuing a trend. Last session, we had several key pieces of legislation on cybersecurity enacted the last day of the session. And to get a number of bills enacted in this Congress is no mean feat. And I really give tremendous credit to members of Congress who have worked really hard to shepherd these bills through on a bipartisan basis. And it's been really wonderful to see these bills being reported out of committee, most often unanimously, but certainly at least on a bipartisan basis. And I think it's because of the care that Congress and the administration are taking in this. I think it's also because we have moved away from our initial ambition of a comprehensive cybersecurity package that would address all of the issues that we want to address in cybersecurity, and broke it down instead into smaller bites, and started by focusing on things around which we thought we could get pretty clear consensus. And this latest batch of information sharing bills reflects that same approach. So this is not about all information sharing that is relevant to cybersecurity. This is about a very particular kind of information sharing of cyber threat indicators. So this is particularly important for those of us at the Department of Homeland Security. I was just telling one of my fellow panelists, I was out at the RSA Cybersecurity Conference last week, the largest cybersecurity conference in the world, they say. And we had a booth on the exposition floor, and you would be, or maybe wouldn't be, I was surprised the number of people who came up to the booth and said, "What is the Department of Homeland Security doing at a cybersecurity conference?" And it made me realize that we have not done a great job of telling our story and our role in cybersecurity. And it's not surprising that a lot of folks aren't aware of it. We're the new kids on the block, really, relatively speaking. But we are about helping all of our stakeholders make wise risk management decisions. And my directorate, the National Protection Programs Directorate, we have the overarching mission of strengthening the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. And particularly in cyber, that means also worrying about the ecosystem in which those key network systems and assets live, right? So we focus on small and medium-sized businesses in addition to large systems and assets that are clearly defined as critical. But critical infrastructure, as you know, are all those things that make up our that really support our day-to-day lives. And what we do in NPPD and our cybersecurity mission is about getting information out to all of those stakeholders as quickly as we can so that they can make wise decisions. And that's it in a nutshell. We provide situational awareness. We build capacity for those folks who are getting this, and our stakeholders are the civilian government, so the non-Title 50 for the lawyers in the room, the .gov world. We have the lead for helping to secure those networks and systems, and then we have the lead with regard to critical infrastructure, those relationships, and helping to make sure that those, in a comprehensive way, are protected. And then we have partners across the government who have the lead for specific sectors like energy, financial services, et cetera. Those are our stakeholders in addition to state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. All right? So we provide them with information as rapidly as we can. We provide them with capabilities to be able to act on that information. We try to work with them to understand their vulnerabilities, to help them with tools that we develop, and we help with mitigation. If there's an incident that's happened, we could go in on request by the entity and help them figure out what's happened and how to rebuild their system in a way that's more secure. We have some direct protection, as I said, of the .gov world. So that's basically our mission, and what this legislation is designed to do is to help advance that mission. And it recognizes that we're all going to be better off if we all have near real-time information about cyber threat indicators. Indicators means this is the kind of information that your technical team could put filters to search for, can look for in order to prevent malicious things from happening on their system, right? So it might be a known bad IP address that's sending, or that you're sending stuff out to, right? It might be a particular piece of malware. What does that malware look like when it's coming across the system, right? So it's technical information that helps network defenders defend their networks. What the legislation says is you can provide that information to the government, And that's okay, and you will not be found liable for providing that cyber threat indicator information to the government. If you don't want to provide it to the government, you can also provide it to an ISAO or an ISAO. It's an Information Sharing and Analysis Organization. ISACs, which are Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, are the most well-known of the ISAOs. I say ISAO, the White House says ISAO. I'm going to make up a song about that. But they're not the only kind, and there are ISACs for most of the major critical infrastructure sectors, but there are other kinds of sharing organizations, and we're seeing more and more of them pop up, and it's an indication to me that sharing of threat indicators is important and still valuable. It is by no means a silver bullet or the answer to all of our problems in cybersecurity. As I say to our secretary, it is necessary but not sufficient, right? So you've got to build a fence, but if that's your only security system, you're in big trouble, right? But it is an important thing, and we see cybersecurity providers, companies, big companies, Intel, Symantec, Palo Alto Networks, and others coming together to pool what used to be very sensitively held, competitive, proprietary information, and that is the cyber threat indicators they're seeing as they defend their customers' networks. And they're making the decision that it's more important that we have as wide a visibility across these indicators as possible, and then we'll compete on how we use that information to protect our customers. And some of that is behavioral analytics, and others can talk more about that on the panel, and I'm sure will, but that's some of where we get to with all of this information. So the bill says you don't have to give it to the government, although we would like you to, because that can help us to help everybody. But you can also get liability protection for sharing it among yourselves with one of these information sharing organizations, which are private sector coming together. The legislation says you get that liability protection if you provide it to the NCIC, that is the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center at the Department of Homeland Security within my directorate, NPPD. Why did the administration make that proposal? One single portal for a newly incentivized. It doesn't mean you can't give the information elsewhere in the government. In existing relationships, you used to work at the Bureau, you want to call your friend at the Bureau. Again, this is not just about reporting, this is not about reporting incidents, this is about sharing specific cyber threat indicator information. You can still share that also with anybody in the government you want to share it with. But we're going to give liability protections to incentivize in a new program to encourage sharing. We might as well encourage that sharing in one place so that we can connect the dots. It just makes good sense, right? And it's our mission. Why the NCIC? Why DHS? Why not somewhere else in the government? Because we are the ones who have that mission to get it out broadly to everybody who could benefit from that information to make us all safer, right? So that's what this bill basically provides. The House has two different versions. The House Homeland Security Committee, not surprisingly, sticks with the DHS and the NCIC as a single portal. We think that's important for all the reasons that we've said. We work hard on building trust. We have privacy baked in, as was referenced earlier, into all of our programs. We're the only department and agency, certainly the first, I think still the only, with a statutory privacy officer. I have my own privacy officer. They are there at the inception of all of our cybersecurity programs and activities. We have privacy impact assessment statements. You can find them on the web. We have transparent and above-the-board relationships with private sector we have built, and we work hard to maintain that trust. So that's why the administration suggested the NCIC and DHS, and that's why the House Homeland Security Committee has done the same. The two Intel committees, not surprisingly, have broadened the aperture a little bit and have also made some other changes, which Judge Wald described and which we can talk about as we go on. But I want to make sure we have a conversation here, but appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about what DHS does.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. And Julia, I know you have some thoughts about the bills and the liability protection, the privacy issues, and so forth, and thought you would share those thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say at the outset that I'm a little bit of an imposter here. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a technology journalist. And I come to this topic really as somebody who covered the technology industry for years. I grew up in Palo Alto, learned to program in 5th grade. And I was writing about the big technology companies until 2009 when I noticed that they were really in the business of selling your data. And it seemed like a weird thing for technology companies to be in, so I switched to writing about the data business, and I haven't ever left that. So take my analysis of legislation with a grain of salt, but I will say this, as somebody who writes about this industry and comes at it from a technology point of view, the thing that I find strange about this legislation is that it seems very clear to me that the biggest problem in cybersecurity right now is not information sharing. It is the incredibly low-hanging fruit of simple defense, right? I don't think there's any question that when you have every single entity in this country being hacked, Wyndham, Target, Sony, JP Morgan, the US government, that we need better defense, right? And what defense means is encrypting your data and using best practices. And what continues to be true in the analysis of these hacks is that the companies weren't doing it. And so there's no penalty for them for not doing it, right? We don't actually fine companies when they lose data. They have to send you that notice saying they're going to give you free credit monitoring, which costs them nothing except their lawyer's time, which they've already paid for in advance. And most people don't take up those offers. And so if you think of it like an oil spill, maybe the first thing you might want to do is sort of increase the penalties for being totally reckless with data. And so that might just balance the system a little more. So given the fact that like the landscape is one that is, I think, undefended, then the question arises, well, okay, putting that aside, Julia, you know, we still need information sharing. So then you get to the question of, well, what information we're being shared? Essentially, these bills, as I see it, are kind of like a see something, say something campaign, right? Which is like, if you remember, after 9/11, we were all encouraged to send in those tips, and I'm sure our friends at the FBI will tell you that, wow, some of those were really, really worthless because we're not really trained. And there was one, very few of those tips actually saw the light of day, but there was one journalist who got the entire roster of tips that were filed at the Mall of America in Minneapolis, and it was horrifying. I saw a bearded man sitting on a bench. I saw a man with a turban walking. He was looking at his phone. It was on and on and on, right? There was nothing, it was just what people thought was unusual to them, to their life, right? And so I guess the thing is, do we think the companies who aren't defending their data are going to send in awesome tips and improve the security of America? Maybe. That might happen. But to me, it doesn't seem like a given. And then when you add the fact that they're getting an exemption from a lot of laws, right? And some of them I think are reasonable. You don't want to have to worry about sharing threat indicators among banks, and so maybe some antitrust exemption for that might seem reasonable. But as a journalist, I really can't abide the exception from FOIA, right? FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, is the way that we, the public, and me as a representative of the public, as someone tries to keep the government honest, that's what allows us to see what the government is doing. And so if we don't have any watchdogs on our government, that's not what we want in a democracy. This entire democracy was built in order to have checks and balances. And so whenever I see a FOIA exemption, unfortunately, I go kind of ballistic, so I'm sorry about that. That's a personal thing. And there are a lot of exemptions in these bills. So I guess the question is really cost-benefit analysis, right? Perhaps some greater tips will be shared, but at what cost? And I'm not enough of a policy person to say I've run the numbers on that. But I would say as a person who understands the technology industry, I see bigger challenges out there that could be addressed in other ways.
Thank you, Julia. Mike, let me turn to you and pick up where Julia is leaving off, and also reference something that Jim Baker said and Julia touched upon, which is the quality of the information that's coming in when we're talking about information sharing. And Jim Baker put it as, you know, we collect a larger data set, but we're really interested in a narrow data set. And so how, you know, and I think he also said, or somebody said, the technology is cheap, it's getting cheaper. I would offer that that may be the case, but the analysis and the good analysis of the information, in my view at least, is still expensive and hard to do. So I'd love for you to pick up on that, and then also talk about some of the other measures in the legislation, the defensive measures that the legislation calls for, and also pick up on something that was mentioned from Shane on an earlier panel, this idea of letters of marque, the piracy analogy, hacking back, and I think the audience would benefit from your thoughts.
Sure. Okay. There's a lot there. I sort of see both sides of the elephant on this issue, having been on both sides of the elephant in my career. What I'll say is, I think the legislation in spirit is on the right track. I do think that there are some core challenges with it, and part of that is the devils are in the details. And what I'm specifically referring to and what Joshua was mentioning is, how are we actually going to share this information and do it in a way that's useful? So, for example, a tip comes in. Let's give a hypothetical. A tip comes in from an intelligence agency, and it says, let's say it says a certain part of an industry is going to get attacked. The government then spends a lot of time declassifying that information, right? It's not an easy task. And it certainly, as far as I know, doesn't typically happen real time, right? In fact, does not happen real time, right? Somebody has to look at it and take that information and declassify certain portions of it. So then they give it to various financial institutions. Let's take a global financial institution. Top 5. They'll look at this information and say, Uncle Sam, thank you so much for your kind, nice thoughts, but you're actually missing this, 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 and this. Then you give it to a bank, let's say a mid-sized bank. A mid-sized bank will say, Uncle Sam, this is awesome. Now, how do I get this to my people? Because the part that I really, really need is still classified. So you've given me A and C, but I kind of need B. And then they send it through the FSISAC, let's say, which is a consortium of 3,000, let's say, institutions. And the mom and pop community bank says, Uncle Sam, I know that your thoughts are well-intentioned here, but what does all this mean? And so part of the challenge, I think, and by the way, this is a good problem to have, right? This is not a bad thing. I'm just pointing out that part of the challenge here is really going to be how we refine the information sharing process. I think that the fact that there's a safe harbor provision is incredibly important, and I think that's a good step forward. But the devil is going to be in the details, and I'm cautiously optimistic to see how that's going to be sorted out. Switching topics to letters of marque. So that's like one of the coolest things I've heard in the last year. And so I was glad that someone had raised it earlier, so I don't have to go into sort of the history of letters of marque. But that's something that, and I take Suzanne's point, and I do take it, that this legislation is not the end-all be-all, and it's not this all-encompassing corpus of how to address every little cyber issue. So I take that, and that's a fair point, or else nothing would have gotten through. That being said, I think a really important issue that the cyber community has to focus on is offense. And I mean pure, unadulterated offense. Other nation states do not have this problem about offense. We have a problem with offense because most of the offensive actions that companies maybe technically are able to take are illegal. And so I'm not a lawyer, and I did not stay in a Holiday Inn last night, so I can't get into the specifics of what's illegal and what's not with regard to things like hacking back. But I know that a lot of it is not allowed. And then even parts of it were allowed, it's a very complicated issue. So for example, let's say you're a corporation and you get hacked by what you think is a nation state. Well, what do you do about that? When you're on the open seas and you see someone coming towards you, you know exactly that's a pirate ship. Or you can see it, it's pretty clear. But in the cyber world, it's quite opaque. And all I'm saying on this point, to answer sort of what Josh's question was it's something we need to start talking about. So industry's interested in hitting back. The question is, how do we as a community, both private sector and public sector, begin to think about this issue of hacking back? There are some interesting technologies out there that are getting really good at pinpointing where those attacks are coming from, right? And certainly the government has agencies that are getting really pretty darn good at pinpointing where those attacks are coming from. So technology is sort of catching up with the thinking on some level. But then there comes, again, the devil in the details of how do we address this issue of offense? What are the rules of the road? And my one sort of voice here is, it's complicated, it's hard, I certainly don't have the answer, but as a community, let's start talking about it.
Great. Michael, thank you. Leo, turning to you, I mean, you're on the front lines of the information sharing that goes on between the Bureau and the private sector. Earlier today, Mike Morales told the audience that he was meeting with a large financial institution, a large bank, and they reported to him that the FBI had recently seen them and came in, said, "You've had a breach, thank you very much," and walked out the door without sharing too much more information. Tell us a little bit operationally on a case level, how does this work when the Bureau is interacting with the private sector, with companies?
I know, thanks, Josh. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. So a couple of things on information sharing. As the Undersecretary said, and everyone would agree, it is necessary but not sufficient. And I'll point to one area where we need to make some progress, and that is with companies reporting breaches. There are some studies out there, and I think our own anecdotal evidence points out that not enough companies report when they have a breach. One study says that in cases where companies are not obligated to report a breach, up to 56% choose not to. So first and foremost, we're blind in many ways when we don't receive reports of a significant breach. So I want to just underscore the importance of information sharing and removing some of the obstacles to information sharing. The legislation goes a long way, I think, in removing some of the liability, but not the liability that most companies are concerned about, and that is regulatory liability and liability from third parties. So with that, we have changed our practice from going and knocking on doors and basically saying, look out, to analyzing what we have and what we can share so that we provide real value. So most of the institutions that I deal with are in the financial sector, and they are not your typical victim. They are very highly resourced, skillful. They have a sophisticated legal counsel, and so they don't act like someone who needs our help very often. And if we continue to knock on doors and say, basically, you have a problem, but we can't tell you anything about it, there would be very few people who would open the door after a while. So in the last few years, we've changed our practice to go back into the intelligence community, providing the information, and ask for declassification to the lowest level possible so that we can provide something useful to the institutions that we're warning. And I think we've gotten some traction on that. A couple of statistics. One is that recent Verizon data breach survey shows that up to 70% of companies that are hacked don't know they've been hacked until somebody else tells them. And in many cases, that's the government. And so we think we provide value in at least identifying the problem for a company. The second thing is that we often have very good intelligence about what a threat actor has done in the past, so that when a company is trying to clean up its network, it's not sufficient to see the small slice on the network that the company can see, but perhaps take some of the lessons learned from the previous breaches that that threat actor may have conducted and look elsewhere on the network and mitigate the problem in a way that is more effective. And third is we think that one of the most effective ways to protect the network is to go after the people who are responsible for hacking into it. And if you can imagine that we don't catch all of the hackers, we don't catch many of them. Many of the hackers go free. But knowing that either the FBI or the Secret Service is after you tends to keep their head down. And so we think it's important for companies to report to us so that even if we can't actually put handcuffs on a hacker, having an indictment and limiting a person's travel and mobility and communication goes a long way into preventing and mitigating the damage that these individuals can do. So First and foremost, we are interested in more information sharing, receiving more information, but right behind that is our other interest, and that is providing value to these networks so that they can protect themselves. And while I still have the mic, I just want to mention we are hiring. So we're in need of cyber talent, so we're looking for smart, curious, hardworking geniuses who will work for little money and long hours on the best mission on the planet, and that is protecting our national security. So if you, many of the people in this room probably already have meaningful work and maybe not be interested, but if you know someone who is, please tell them to go to FBI.gov. That's my selfless plug for computer scientists, special agents, and analysts who want to work for the most rewarding organization I can imagine, and on the best and most challenging problems the country faces. So with that, I'll turn it back.
So I just
Please go ahead,
cannot
Suzanne.
sit here and not take advantage of that wonderful plug and piggyback to say, but it is really a challenge, as you are probably aware, for the government to bring in the cyber talent that we need to do these missions that we're engaged in, and we are competing with the private sector. And I've about decided that we really do need to adopt a different model, a different mindset. I came out of a traditional national security world in which, the idea was you'd hire somebody right out of school and they would retire, from you at 30 or 40 years later from your same organization. And that is not the way of the world, and it's not the way we're going to be able to operate. So what we're looking for is, what I've talked to the private sector about is you help us build that pipeline. We'll take them when they first graduate, and we'll give them on-the-job training. We'll give them really neat stuff to do, far more responsibility than they will typically get in the private sector starting out, because we have no choice. And then you come and lure them away with way more money than we could ever pay them. And you give them that great private sector experience, and then after their kids have gone to college and they miss the mission, they'll come back to us. So that's where we're. So if that sounds appealing to you, think about the Department of Homeland Security.
There'll be a job fair afterward. It occurs to me, Leo, you mentioned the Secret Service, and it occurs to me that, as the conference winds down, we haven't heard from, unless I missed someone from the Secret Service on a panel or present to you today. And so my question is...
Yes, it is.
It is.
They are brothers and sisters, yep.
We haven't...
As is the Bureau.
That's absolutely right.
So, we both share this space, and luckily for the country, you have two Type A personality agencies that are going after this problem. And we are challenged to cooperate and to share. And I can tell you that in New York and around the country, we are doing that. We understand that we're accountable to the taxpayer, and we can't hide the ball from each other. So without referring to specific cases, significant breaches here in New York are worked by an FBI agent and a Secret Service agent side by side. We have access to each other's databases. We go to the assistant U.S. attorneys together. We go and debrief the technical teams together. So for here in New York, it is a seamless team. We divide up the work, which is plentiful. There's no need to fight over it. And I think it works extraordinarily well. They're a very, very competent, very capable agency, and we're happy to work with them when we can. We sometimes diverge in our missions. We share the space of criminal activity under statute. Both the FBI and the Secret Service share jurisdiction over criminal intrusions, but the FBI does have the lead for espionage and other national security violations under Section 1030 of Title 18. So we overlap in many ways, but in those areas we cooperate effectively.
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not going to give a pitch, although we actually happen to be hiring as well. True statement. And actually, we have a guy right here, Danny Schwartz, and if you're interested, you can go speak to him afterwards. That's also true. That's right.
We're not hiring. We're a nonprofit.
So, When Leo was talking about cyber breaches, this is something we had talked about before when we met right outside, and that is there's an impression when you hear the word cyber breach of the horde of these cyber attackers coming over the Maginot Line, right? And I would point out, and I think it's a really important point, and one that Mike Morrell mentioned, and that is the real problem is the Trojan horse within. Right? It's the insider. And part of this information sharing public-private partnership has to address this issue of the insider. It's much easier when you're focusing on common enemies of APT threats, and it makes things very simple, very black and white. It gets increasingly complicated, right, when it's your own employees. And that's true whether it's in the government, where I was deeply involved in some of those high-profile cases and specifically the results of those, and also in the private sector where we're dealing with clients who have serious breaches that are from within. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this legislation impacts this sharing that the private sector is willing to do with the government when the attack is not a nation state, not an evil hacker network that wears masks, but the person, Sally Creamcheese, who sits right next to the CIO, right? And so I just sort of posit that to the group. I posit that to all of us. How is the predominance of the insider threat going to impact information sharing? You know, I'll throw out some statistics, which I think are really interesting. This is from the Raytheon-Ponemon studies. My numbers aren't exactly accurate, but if you Google it, which I'm sure some folks here of Apple's, it's about right. And that is over 65% of all information that's expropriated comes from the inside, not the outside. And a lot of that information is expropriated by privileged users. And over 70% of privileged users access information outside of their work, outside of the relevance of their work. And what's really interesting is 60% of those do so out of curiosity. I mean, that's what we're fighting against here, right? Just innate curiosity. And it causes problems and trouble. So just, again, posit that to the group. How is that going to impact information sharing with the government? How is that going to impact information sharing among different businesses?
Great question. So interestingly, there's no law that prevents any company from heavily surveilling their employees. In fact, most companies do. So there's no bill needed to find the insider threat. And in fact, I think if anyone, the NSA should probably be most embarrassed, right, about the Snowden leaks from the insider threat perspective, because you would expect them to have the most advanced controls for access of information. And the truth is that, like, you know, above and beyond this legislation, we're seeing a trend of increasing surveillance inside of a workplace. When you work, your company has the right to read every email you've written, personal or professional, every website you visit. And this is changing the nature of work and actually the nature of our society in ways that I think we should think about. What's interesting about this bill is that so the bill talks about increased powers of surveillance for companies to surveil its networks, which includes employees and sometimes customers. And it gives companies an exemption to the one anti-hacking law we have, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is really worrying to me because already companies have a massive ability to surveil. They have, if you work inside of a company, what I say to people who say they don't care about privacy, I'm like, that's fine, you don't care about privacy, you don't need to care about the NSA, you don't need to care about Google, but your boss is actually NSA to you, right? Like, I'm NSA to my children, right? Who surveils you changes, but people care about one aspect of it, and often they care about their employer. And so then when you give a hacking exemption to the employer, that's really powerful medicine. That means that they can go in and distort things in the traffic and do things that, is kind of like what you called piracy on the high seas. And so that's another part of the bill that I very much worry about. And then I also want to just step back one bit from this conversation, which is that the underlying assumption of all of these conversations is that increased surveillance increases security. And I think it's worth just putting like a pause on that, because actually we don't have the evidence yet. We have actually a lot of counter evidence for that. What we have is that mass surveillance, which is what this threat analysis would be, right? Collect everything that looks anomalous and shoot it up to the government. That's a mass surveillance program. That's not a targeted threat surveillance. The Snowden documents, you look through them, the ones that have been publicized, over and over again, you see the analysts saying, I'm drowning. I can't even sort this data. Turn off the ingest. And we also have seen that in every terrorist incident, which thank God there have been very few since then, there was already information in the government's files on the people involved. And so what we have is that we have a system that collects every bit of information about everyone, but is it increasing security? I think the jury is out. We have not seen the evidence that that's true. And I think that's the premise of this bill as well. And I just say we have to question that premise. And the reason I say we have to question that is we pay for it, right? We are the citizens, and this is a gigantic industry. The NSA's budget is $10 billion a year, right? And by the way, their job is to hire all the best mathematicians and find all the best cyber threats and then distribute them to everybody. This is an existing program. They declassify them, it goes to the DHS, ECS system, and so I actually am like, I'm on board with that. I'm like, how about we just leave it to the experts and don't give anybody an exemption from the law, and they're getting tons of money. I'm not sure I want to increase the spending on something that hasn't proven results.
Yeah, I'll make one point about, it's a small point, but I think it's important. And that is, companies don't have a right to monitor your activity on when you work for them. You consent to their monitoring as a condition of your employment. And I think
small point.
It's a small point, but I think it matters. Now, here's why it matters, because we're giving away, if you're talking about privacy, we are giving away a lot more willingly than the government is monitoring. So in the case of surveillance, we find ourselves having very little of the information that is useful. It's often in the hands of third parties that collect it with the agreement of people who give it to them. And so I'll just make that as a clarification, that you're not actually being monitored as a right of the employer.
You could choose not to work.
You could choose not to work for that employer.
You can also choose not to work or to use the internet, because every terms of service also makes you agree to this. So yes, you can choose that. And by the way, I just want to point out as a tiny plug, since everyone's making a plug for my book, Dragnet Nation, in which I attempted to do that for 1 year and to live privately. And boy, was it a total disaster.
But data collectors and data aggregators and companies that you do business with, someone said it earlier, make sometimes far more money from the data they collect and sell than they do from the product they're actually offering you. So I think if you're talking about privacy, you have to bring in the private parties that you're sharing and agreeing to allow them to distribute and sell, along with the argument that the government should do less. I think if you're talking about privacy, it ought to include all of it.
I agree, and I make that argument extensively in my book, which is that I actually think we have all fallen for the free, right? We love free. We're like, sign me up, and then we're really hurt. Like, oh my gosh, they're selling our data? Like, how do you think they're going to make money, right? So I try to really pay for products. Actually, I pay for an email program. I know it's shocking. There, you can buy one. It's really hard to find them, actually. But I pay for cloud storage. I pay for all sorts of services that everyone in here is getting for free. But I do that because I actually think it's important to change the paradigm. And we are all complicit in that change.
I see we're heading towards 4:30. I want to ask folks, because we are the last panel, and our panel is charged with looking towards the future. If 2014, by some descriptions, was the year of the breach, what is coming in this year, in 2015, and into 2016? What can you see from your various seats? What is coming over the horizon?
It's, from my observation point, it's the year of the regulator. We're seeing, in the absence of legislation that is detailed in terms of prescribing specific settings and specific acts that companies should take in highly regulated sectors, we're going to see the regulators really come to life in 2015 and moving forward with specific programs for companies to follow and significant penalties if they don't.
And certainly you do see a lot of regulators weighing in from across the spectrum with different guidance.
I have kind of totally different tack on what's coming, which is I think that in world of mass surveillance that we are living in, and that cybersecurity is then the rubric under which we justify it currently, that there's really no defense for the individual than to wear a mask. And so I see a rise of disinformation, that people are spoofing their identities and spoofing their computer addresses in ways that I think we will all come to regret as a society, because it makes everything that we see less trustworthy.
Individual counter surveillance?
Individual, and I think it goes up the chain. Everyone is doing counter surveillance, right? And I think that's going to become a new skill set.
Thank you. Michael?
I mean, those two are great, actually. So to be different, I would say it's the year of the mathematician. We're going to be relying. I have to explain that?
Just a little.
So I think we're going to be relying more and more on data scientists and mathematicians to work through these issues, to work through the regulation and how we comply, to work through issues of transparency and privacy, to work through issues of actual information sharing and making it more rapid, to work through issues of the insider threat. Yes, of course, these all require policies, and you can't do this without the policymaker. But I would say in the next year, we're going to realize we also can't do this without the mathematician.
Suzanne?
So I hate to end on a down note, and I'm generally a very upbeat person, but I have to confess that I really do worry that in the next year or so, it will be the year of the destructive attacks. We focused on exfiltration of data and DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. Even with the Sony incident, all of the attention, right, was on the salacious emails and the theft of movies before they came out, and far less attention was paid, for reasons I'm not clear on the destructive nature of that attack. That there was destructive malware deployed that destroyed computers and data irretrievably. And it was a reminder of the 30,000 computers destroyed, turned into bricks in the Saudi Aramco attack. And it was a deployment of destructive malware inside the United States by an actor that is not the most capable of the adversaries that we face. And so it may lead then to the year of the regulator, because once we start seeing if we start seeing destructive attacks, I think there will be some calls for that. But that's I'm sorry to say that's what keeps me awake at night. But we're all working really hard to try to both prevent those things from happening and mitigate them. And I think we're actually making progress every day. So
great, thank you.
Hope is not a plan. We have other plans, but I am hopeful.
I see Karen has taken the podium.
Yeah, wait a minute before we thank this panel. I just have a few concluding comments for the day. And normally I'll give you at the end of these conferences, tidbits and takeaways, but this has been way too much to absorb for me to have too many thoughts. So first I want to thank two people that I was kind of waiting to thank. One is Susan Quattrone, who helps run the center, who's done tremendous amount for this conference and for all the other things we do. The other one is Tim Straubing, who is the director of the Madison Policy Forum and who works with me on many projects and who made this particular event possible. So thank you to both of you. I also want to encourage you to read both the morning brief, the Soufan Group morning brief, and the now Strauss-Friedberg cyber brief. If you don't get them, then you're just uninformed. And you should totally get them because they're great products, and we're getting better and better at them. I don't think we're going to have a ton more events this year, so probably we won't see you, at least not in this big a forum, until the fall, but I look forward to it. My takeaway from today is that, yes, these are very difficult problems. Yes, there's way too many technological words that I wish I never had to learn that I'm now familiar with. Yes, there is a conversation that still needs to be had, but today surprised me. The degree of thoughtfulness and generosity and sheer studiousness that has gone in to this topic by everybody that we brought here today should make us all, despite everybody's pessimism, feel really hopeful about the future. So thank you for coming. There's a reception afterwards, so please join us. And thank you.